hopefully this is the beginning of a set of conversations anyway. So over to you, Nur.
Okay, thank you. So just a huge thanks to everyone, to Sajjad for organizing, and to Michael, and to all of the presenters. It's been a very rich collection of talks and ideas. And I've been given the dubious privilege of summing up a very diverse group of papers and, perhaps commenting. So I've understood my brief as to sort of pull out some of the key themes, and perhaps those can turn into a discussion now or into a future discussion or set of discussions. So just briefly, when Sajjad very kindly asked me to give the final comments on today, I objected because I'm not a philosopher, nor am I a scholar of Hadot. I do know a little bit about decoloniality and how to apply it to the study of pre-modern Islamic knowledge systems, but my own training is in social history and philology. So, on this topic of kind of pre-modern epistemological systems, one of the ones that I'm very interested in is divination, right, as a way of knowing, and as a way of knowing that kind of defies many of the aspects of kind of colonial knowledge systems that we have been critiquing throughout the day. And there's one form of divination in which the diviner has to receive his knowledge from the unseen world or from the supernatural by working together with a simpleton, someone whose mind has been unformed by philosophy or by the ways of the world, a naive person, if you will. And that person is the conduit for the inspiration that will allow the divination to take place. So you can see me as the simpleton through whom the divination about today's themes will take place, as my mind is unfettered by philosophical training. So I would say, just to sum up briefly, actually, one thing I would say is that, just to open my talk up a little bit, one area that I noticed it might have been a good idea for us to discuss at the very beginning of the day is what we actually understand by decoloniality. Because I noticed that there was a great deal, a lot of different understandings of what we mean by this term, right? Is it a set of texts? Is it a paradigm? Is it a set of principles? If it's a set of thinkers, who are those thinkers? And I would like to just sort of clarify my own understanding of what decoloniality is. I think aligns most closely with what our colleague Oludamini laid out in his paper, which is basically he spoke specifically of the African decolonial writers and thinkers. And I would also include in that a lot of the philosophy that is going on in Latin America and Australia around indigenous forms of thought as a way of sort of, I would say, not necessarily accessing in a sort of utopian way of sort of recreating a pre-colonized past, but of looking at other forms of knowledge that exist outside of the colonial structure, if such a thing is even possible, with a vision to creating a collectivist world-making project. Not necessarily in a universalizing sense. This could be many different world-making projects, but it is fundamentally a project of looking toward non-colonial sources of knowledge and systems of knowledge. And if it's a set of thinkers we're referencing, I would say, for me, the main decolonial thinkers I look to as a source of method and paradigms are Linda Tuhiwai-Smith. And I'm unpacking my library because I've just relocated to the States. So I've actually got her book right here. So I would say, oh, can you even see this? No, my background is preventing it. Well, this is interesting. I feel like there's a critique to be made here of textuality. So this is Linda Tuhiwai-Smith book, Decolonizing Methodologies, where she talks about Indigenous Australian ways of working with Indigenous Australian epistemologies and knowledge practices as a way of decolonizing knowledge structures. I've got Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I think is an excellent example of, if we're talking about a set of thinkers who are working in a decolonial mode, as well as Arturo Escobar, who is working with, and Vivesh de Castro, who are looking at indigenous South American epistemological systems and ways of knowing and ways of thinking and ways of creating worlds. And you know, I mean, I'm not sure if it's a valid critique to call these ideological or political, because they are political projects, and I don't think that that invalidates them. But I would say that in addition to the thinkers laid out in Oludamini's talk, I would take this set of thinkers as well as being central to laying out the principles of decolonization. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, decoloniality is not whatever we want it to be, right? It's sort of, you know, you can't set it up as a straw man and then, you know, and then deconstruct it because you know, fundamentally disagree with gender studies or what. I mean, you know, that's not what we're talking about here. There's you know, a set of principles, a set of ideas. And I would say it's a political struggle leading toward a kind of communal intellectual liberation, right? Not necessarily a universal one, but it could be an individual project. It could be on a level of a sort of, you know, scholarly microcosm, but that's basically what you're working toward, which I think, again, was very much echoed in our colleagues' talk. And, you know, along with the set of thinkers, I would also include African-American feminist thinkers like Audre Lorde, and as well as Afrofuturist contemporary artists emerging out of the States who look at, you know, sources of knowledge outside of kind of American imperialist systems. So I've got their books sitting on my desk, but oh, you can see this one. Okay, so this is Black Quantum Futurism, and this is a group of Afrofuturist contemporary artists operating out of Philadelphia, whose principles very much align closely with the act of decolonizing knowledge. So again, all of this is just to say that there are a set of thinkers and activities and methods in place that do define decoloniality. It's not a nothing term. We can't just dismiss it, right? There's a lot of very careful work and effort that goes into this body of knowledge and action. And I would also say that decoloniality, as well as a project of world making, you know, is not a utopian return to the past as such. You know, I would argue that it is, you know, in addition to, you know, kind of, you know, a project of liberation in some respects. It does certain things that post-colonial critique doesn't do, right? So I think it was in Paul's paper, he talked a bit about Edward Said as kind of a political project that, you know, is seeking to claim hegemony within the Western academic structure. I would actually agree with that critique entirely. And I think that when we talk about decoloniality, we need to separate different schools of thought and post-colonial thinkers emerging from the elites of the global South, trained in elite institutions in the global North, are not decolonial thinkers at all. They're interesting, they have interesting things to say. I don't disagree with many of their critiques, but that's not decoloniality. So I would not say that Edward Said, for instance, is a decolonial thinker, not at all. So that's just to clarify a bit my understanding of what decoloniality is, who the sets of thinkers are, what the sets of principles are that we're working with. And I thought that that's kind of worth saying because I don't think we managed to kind of define that at any point. Like we were all sort of talking with an assumption that we all know what decoloniality is. And it turned out we all have very different understandings, which is, you know, fine, but it might be good for a discussion going forward to have a clear set of notions. I would also say that my own understanding of decoloniality is that, yes, it's a set of principles and a set of philosophies and thoughts, but it's also a mode, I would say, a mode of being and a method, as well as an intellectual paradigm. And it's a kind of mode of being and a method that takes questions of materiality and physicality and embodiment into account, as well as, you know, mundane political questions of class and access to resources into account as well when we're thinking about how we access and create knowledge. So, you know, I always, whenever I find myself in a setting where philosophy is being discussed, I'm always struck by the disembodiment of the ideas, as though they didn't emerge out of bodies, right? That need to be fed and clothed, and you know, all of the labor that goes into that and the context that they're in. And I mean, I think Lisa touched on this a little bit in her paper on this question of embodiment and gender and how that actually shapes the way that we think. So to me, a decolonial mode of being and mode of thinking is something that takes this question of materiality and physicality and kind of embodiment and presence into account when we're thinking about the way that we do scholarship and the way that we relate to each other as scholars. So all of that is just a preamble to my very brief, hopefully very brief summing up, because I'm sure you've all had enough of Zoom for the day. I want to talk about 3 quick themes that were brought up, but I felt not explored adequately. The first theme is grandmothers. The second theme is air conditioning. And the third theme is institutions and the parenthesis. And it'll be clear what I'm talking about as when I get to that. So grandmothers. And grandmothers as a source of knowledge and conceptual sophistication. So this is something that I learned from Afrofuturist writings, who see the grandmother as a source, not just of traditional, not just this notion of this very gendered notion of the grandmother as a source of traditional knowledge that she passes on, but the grandmother as a source of conceptual sophistication and theorizing and critical theorizing. And I think that this is key. And it came up, I think in Oludameni's talk again, I forget who was it? Yeah, you're nodding. Okay, good. Yeah. So I think that this is key because it really, the figure of the grandmother as theorist disrupts the hegemonic Western projects of sort of Plato to NATO entirely. All right. If we're looking at a masculinist, textual, empiricist construction of knowledge as being, a hegemonic colonial project that is still doing violence to us, the grandmother as source of conceptual knowledge and theory breaks that paradigm altogether. And so I feel like, when we look at who and what is a valid source of knowledge, we need to completely think outside of the box if we're being decolonial. And I feel like as long as we're in academia, in our Zoom boxes, in our institutions, using certain frames of reference and terminology and performances as a way to sort of skirmish with each other for legitimacy, we're not being decolonial. That's kind of the opposite of decoloniality, right? We're just perpetuating and reinscribing the Western structures and assumptions of knowledge that, we've been indoctrinated in through our educations in Western institutions. So yes, so grandmother, I think, is the first theme, and I would love for us to talk a bit about that more in the discussion if we have time. And I would say another thing, when I think of decoloniality, I very much think, and I've been talking with Tariq a bit about this, who's in the audience, so apologies for repeating. I feel that if we're adopting a genuinely decolonial approach to knowledge and to relating to each other, and to kind of reinventing other futures and ways of knowing and disruptive collective projects of knowledge creation, I'm a bit of a pessimist as to whether we can do this within the academic structures that exist and the sort of parallel structures that exist, like the library, museum, the archive. These are the fundamental, I think it was in Paul's talk, he mentioned very accurately that these are the structures that uphold white supremacy and imperialism to this very day, and they still are. And you see it in very real terms in the sense of the ways that gatekeeping happens in order to ensure that certain types of people from certain classes get access to certain positions and certain resources. And then by having our discussion of decoloniality purely within these institutions, we're defeating ourselves. Basically, right? I mean, we as long as we're perpetuating and reinscribing these structures and structures and assumptions of legitimacy on ourselves, we cannot be decolonial, right? And so I would just say that part of when I say decoloniality is a mode of being. And it's an action. I think part of that is relinquishing our own claims to legitimacy, relinquishing some of our performances of academic legitimacy, relinquishing our status, or at least disrupting it, because fine, we're all enmeshed in capitalism and we still have to pay bills and we're not good, the revolution isn't going to happen tomorrow and free us all, right? So we still need a salary, fine. But at the same time, we need to consciously disrupt those structures and not just perpetuate them. Which brings me to my second theme I want to talk about, which is air conditioning. It struck me as well over the course of the talks that we're all in these disembodied, air-conditioned, cosseted boxes, both physically and then, on the screen. And again, the very construction of the ways that we talk to each other is already predicated on structures of oppression that we are all enmeshed in. And unless we acknowledge that and call it out, I don't think that, again, by perpetuating these structures of I have no air conditioning. Actually, I don't either, but I'm just making a point. So I don't have air conditioning, but I do have a roof over my head, and I have a house, and I have, a number of things, working infrastructure. I open the tap and water comes out, all sorts of things. But yeah, so I think, we ourselves, and this goes back to Sajjad's point that he mentioned at the beginning about our own positionality, that I think we need to kind of take into account when we're having these discussions. What are we doing and what are we saying and how are we being, that actually just reinforces the very hierarchies that we're attempting to. So good, turns out a lot of us don't have air conditioning. Okay, maybe. Maybe that was a bad example, but we can keep talking about it in the discussion. I hazard to say that none of us struggled to attend a Zoom for 4 hours in the middle of the working day. I think that's a fair thing to say. And I think we need to think a little bit about that as well. And this question of what our kind of, engagement with the question of philosophy is, right? I often find that the focus is purely on thought. So that question of air conditioning brings us back to the body, right? And the fact that we are embodied. And I thought that one of the most eloquent moments of the conference is when Oludamani's daughter appeared on the screen with her music, reminding us that we exist in material settings and physical settings, and we're enmeshed in networks and networks of kinship that are themselves sources of knowledge, right? Us philosophizing abstractly for the course of an afternoon is not, sure, we can legitimate that as a way of producing knowledge, but it's not the only way of producing knowledge, and it's certainly not a decolonial way of producing knowledge. Like the fact that we're not going outside of the academy, to me, is very problematic if we're attempting to apply a decolonial framework to what we're doing. So yeah, I think that brings me to my final theme, which is this question of the institution and the parenthesis. And by the parenthesis, I mean, on every workshop that I'm invited to, or maybe you're invited to, we have next to our names a parenthesis, right? With our institutional affiliation in it, yes? And I think that this, to me, really emphasizes the problem with applying decolonial methodologies to the academy, which is that the academy itself, because it perpetuates colonial and imperialist ideologies, is resistant to being decolonized. And as long as we, as organizers of events and as self-proclaimed producers of knowledge, perpetuate these structures and aesthetics and ways of being, such as having to have an institutional affiliation next to your name in order for your words to be legitimated. Again, I think that this is something that, as a mode of being decolonial, we need to think about changing. So yes, I don't want to take up too much time. So grandmother's air conditioning, parenthesis, and yeah, I think I will just conclude very briefly, going back to this question of kind of what do we do, right? And what is the meaning of what we're doing? Like, it's all well and good to discuss philosophy amongst ourselves, ensconced in Zoom, some of us with air conditioning, some of us without, but all of us with a roof over our heads, and, engage amongst ourselves in this group. All of us with a parenthesis next to our name, of an institutional affiliation but if we are genuinely thinking in decolonial terms, what kind of project could we create that would actually decolonize, for instance, the study of philosophy or the study of pre-modern Islam, including Islamic texts? And I agreed very much with the, I don't think we should throw philology away or pre-modern masculinist textual traditions away. I think that Hadot, and going back to Hadot, is, this notion that by engaging with and reading an ancient text can actually be a process of a transformative process of changing the self and stepping outside of the self. And so I think that's actually an excellent way of looking at pre-modern Islamic textual traditions through a decolonial framing. But I think that one thing I would like to see is actual change in the way that we relate to each other as thinkers and as academics, right? Like maybe we include practitioners in our discussions. Maybe we, reach out to Sufi orders. Maybe, we include groups and thinkers and voices whose ideas are not legitimated by the very institutions that are upholding Western imperialism that we are critiquing, right? And until we include them, or don't believe that our efforts are decolonial, or until we step outside of the academy, I'm a pessimist as far as decolonizing the academy is concerned. So just to conclude briefly, in terms of ideas for collective projects and suggestions, I too do not have the answer for how to solve the problem of a Western intellectual genealogy stemming from Plato that has led to some of the worst genocides in the history of mankind. I don't have the answer for how to dismantle that. What I can suggest is that on a smaller human level, we think about our own positionality, even things as small as the parenthesis next to our name indicating which institution we belong to, and does that need to be there if we're attempting to be decolonial. These small acts of disrupting the structures that we're enmeshed in, I think can be a way of chipping away or at least gesturing toward another possibility or another reality, kind of stripping away and stepping down from our own claims to legitimacy and authority, I think is important, and actually maybe even would chime nicely with Hadot and notions of kind of spiritual humility as well. So yeah, I think just as a suggestion, I was really glad to hear, tried to get rid of my parenthesis. It's okay, Tariq. I have a parenthesis too. It's okay. We all do. So I think the idea is just, so for instance, like when we organize projects, I was very glad to hear Moreshin Allahyari's project mentioned. And this is it's basically an online contemporary art and archiving project to disrupt the gatekeeping that archives and libraries and museums do vis-a-vis Islamic manuscripts. So she's basically taken manuscripts that she was working with as part of an art project, made them available on a page, but the page itself is in part password protected, whereby you can only access it if you know Persian or Arabic. And like, sure, there are lots of problematics with that in terms of like internal ummatic hierarchies, linguistic hierarchies, absolutely. And yet it's a very interesting project that tries to disrupt the gatekeeping of Western colonial institutions and their archives. So, I think that this kind of project going forward, where we look completely outside of the Western academy and its funding structures and its knowledge structures, and, really genuinely take, these thinkers such as Escobar and Tohiwai Smith seriously, and think about what knowledge is outside of the academic structures that perpetuate colonialism and imperialism. I feel like this is a small step in a direction toward a genuine decolonial practice that we can all do together. So I'll conclude there. And, thanks for listening to me talk about grandmothers and air conditioning. I'm not sure that's what you were expecting after a day of intricate philosophical discussions, but my claim is also that grandmothers are as intricate in philosophical terms as any text written by a man. So I'll just conclude there. And Sajjad, I hope I haven't embarrassed you, and I hope that I got to some of the best, some of the discussions that I hope we can have.
No, thank you. If anything, it's quite useful precisely because we want to think about what we're going to do next, right? So there are lots of options about what we can do and how we take things forward. I'm just aware of the time. So anyone have any last comments? I'm also aware that I need to let these guys go as well, who are sitting here. And it has been a long day on Zoom. So any last comments from anyone before I give my last word of thanks?
So just a word, if I may.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I agree. That certainly, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. I think this is the first video conference of its kind, or any kind of a get-together devoted to the theme that we've been studying today. And so it would be unreasonable, I think, to expect perfection for a first time. And I also think it's slightly misleading to say that we're all here entrenched academics. This may be true of the speakers, but it's not true of everyone in the audience. I know that several of my undergrad students from the Universidad Panamericana in Mexico are on board. They don't have any letters in front of their name. And yet, thanks to Zoom, they are being exposed to this kind of material for what I assume is the first time in their lives. So I don't think that's entirely useless. And I don't think we should just cast out the baby with the bathwater and say, well, what we're doing now is only perpetuating oppression and capitalism and imperialism and so forth. It's certainly not a perfect solution, but it's a step in the right direction, I would like to believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, apologies if my critique came across as too harsh. I don't think that we ourselves are perpetuating capitalism and oppression. I think we're trying really hard not to, but there are certain conventions of our field that we are inculcated in that we need to break out of. So like, for instance, it would have been great to have one of the students speak, for instance, or have, you know, speakers who aren't necessarily attached to an institute, or, you know, something like this. But I agree. And I think that actually the digital realm is a good way to disrupt, I think, some of the kind of worst abuses of the academy, right? You can broaden, you know, your audience, and you can engage more widely, and you can create, you know, these collectivist projects of disrupting gatekeeping through online resources. So I'm totally on board. So yes, please don't take my critique as anything other than a kind of well-meant suggestion for how to rethink how we do workshops.
Thank you. I think I should bring things to a close. You know, there will probably be, I hope there'll be a number of outcomes which will come from this, right? So there probably will be relatively traditional, not terribly decolonial workshops in that sense, because we are still very much stuck in our institutional homes. But I do hope there are other ways of doing things, and certainly what I want to do going forward is, if we're going to have more of these sorts of workshops, they are always open. So for example, I put it out on Facebook. Anyone who wants to can have the link. They don't actually have to be involved in the university. I know for a fact there are a few people on this conversation who are not members of the university. And I did say at the beginning, when they contacted me, they're more than welcome to ask questions and get involved. And if they'd like to be involved, that's absolutely fine. And yes, we will think about how to do things moving forward. So let me, at that point, just kind of bring things to a close. Thank you to everyone who's spoken. Thank you to Mike. Thank you to Olodamini. Thank you to Lumia. Thank you to Lisa, to Paul, to Mohammed, and of course to Nur as well. Thank you to everyone who has been involved in this conversation. If you have any thoughts, right, email me, email Mike about how we might move forward. I know Mike and I will certainly catch up in the coming weeks to think about things that we can do and different kinds of activities that we can do moving forward. And one last thing I would say, which I'm quite keen on, is that this was mentioned also by Olodamini, and I think I did at the beginning, that for me, one of the binaries that we do want to overcome is this thinking versus action, or theory versus praxis binary, which you know, is in some ways misleading, because theory in itself does not necessarily have to be divorced from any sort of praxis. And even when we think about thinking, It doesn't have to be in this kind of rather rarefied, disembodied manner anyway. Thinking is something that you do. It's an action. It's what you do in a particular context. So let's come up with really exciting ways that we can move forward. Is what I would say. And it's about options. It's not about creating new kinds of hierarchies, new kinds of master narratives that will replace existing ones. So with that, thank you once again to everyone. I have recorded everything mainly for internal purposes, but if anyone does want to have access to it, I'll try and make it available to you, as long as you do not share it beyond this circle. Just, well, you can. We'll think about what we want to do with that. But in the first instance, I think we'll keep it amongst ourselves. So I'll stop.